Okay, hello everyone. On behalf of the Freedom Project, I'd like to thank you all for coming to today's talk entitled The Rooster Falls and the Crocodile Rises, Zimbabwe's Militarized Transition and the Prospects for the Future. The topic of today's event concerns a recent and graciously bloodless coup in Zimbabwe nearly 1 year ago today. Today's speaker, Shingirai Taodzera, originally born in Zimbabwe, is currently a dissertation fellow with the Freedom Project and a doctoral candidate in international development at the University of Ottawa in Canada, where Shingirai has been named a Trillium Scholar, a scholarship designed to attract international talent to Canada. Shingirai was awarded also a Mellon Fellowship and has earned 2 master's degrees on 2 distinct continents. Taodzera's PhD research concerns the political impact of Uganda's emerging oil industry. And in addition to his many achievements as a young scholar, I can personally attest to his kindness and his willingness and enthusiasm to discuss ideas. For all of the above reasons, I think we're in for a bit of a treat this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming Shingi.
Thank you very much, JP, for that elegant introduction, and I hope that I won't underperform. Thank you so much for coming, and good evening to you all. Today's talk is very interesting to me personally as a Zimbabwe-born young scholar, and the timing of this talk was coincidental, but also very befitting, because this month we are recognizing the 1-year anniversary of the coup in Zimbabwe. So this coup was very significant because this was the first time that we had a militarized transition in Zimbabwe. Even though we had contested elections before, for the first time ever, we saw an unprecedented involvement of the army in directly determining who holds political office. So this talk aims to firstly revisit the coup and assess the developments that have occurred since then also allow us to discuss the prospects for the future now that we have a new government in power, and what this means going forward. So the coup removed the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and I must emphasize that it actually feels strange calling him former president, because from the time I was born, I only knew that there was one president, who was Robert Mugabe. So he was removed from power in November last year. At the time, he was aged 93, and he turned 94 years old in February. So the coup was significant in that it had minimal levels of violence, and this earned it several nicknames and terms, academic scholarly terms, to try and describe its unique nature. Others called it a soft coup. Some called it a garden coup. Others called it a military facilitated transition, while others simply called it a coup that was not a coup. But in the words of Ugandan journalist Charles Onyango Obo, if it looks like a coup, walks like a coup, quacks like a coup, then it is a coup. So my talk is going to be structured as follows. Having a little, oops, right. I have a little problem with the computer, but that's fine. So my talk is going to be structured as follows. I'll begin with briefly revisiting the coup and what it signifies, and next I'll look at the election last July, which is significant because it was the key, it was the second and final phase in the transition from Robert Mugabe to the current president. I'll also then focus on the new cabinet, the current state of affairs in Zimbabwe, and conclude with a discussion of what all these developments mean for Zimbabwe going forward. So I'll begin by just quickly going through the key developments that occurred as the coup unfolded last year. So on the 6th of November, former President Mugabe fired his deputy president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who fled to South Africa 2 days ago, claiming that he had been informed by intelligence officials that his life was in danger. Subsequently, on the 13th of November, the Defense Forces commander, General Constantino Chiwenga, conducted a press conference in the company of about 90 senior military officials, where he warned President Mugabe to stop the purge of senior ZANU PF leaders, and he threatened that should this not stop, he would, the army would intervene to protect the revolution. But after the statement, the ZANU PF national chairman and also the chairperson of the Youth League both issued separate statements where they dismissed Chiwenga's statement and called it treasonous and said that the army should be confined to the barracks and stay there. The following day, and true to his word, Chiwenga deployed the army into the streets of Harare, and at night, the army also conducted raids on key individuals who were aligned with Robert Mugabe. They also occupied strategic points such as the airport, the National Broadcasting Authority, parliament, government buildings, and also blocked roads leading to strategic points, mainly around the capital city. Now, on the 15th of November, the Army Chief of Staff, Brigadier General, it's actually General S.B. Moyo, appeared on television at 5 a.m. And this was unprecedented again because we never had a news bulletin read by a man in uniform before. But he announced that the army had arrested criminals around President Mugabe, and he claimed that these criminals, whom he did not name, were responsible for the suffering of Zimbabweans. He also said that the army was conducting what he called Operation Restore Legacy, and then uttered the now popular words that the president and his family were safe, and that in a short while the army would end the operation and restore the country to civilian rule. Now, on the 18th of November, the army, alongside different political parties in Zimbabwe, mobilized the masses to march in the capital, Harare, and they also marched in different cities in the country, calling for Mugabe to resign. And as all this was going on, negotiations for Mugabe's exit were ongoing. They were mainly conducted between Chiwenga and the security chiefs, and also other individuals from the Southern African Development Community, and they were mediated by Father Fidelis Mukonori, who also happened to be President Robert Mugabe's personal friend and a Catholic priest. So now, on the 19th of November, something very interesting happened. It was widely expected that Mugabe would announce that he's resigning, and he conducted this press conference flanked by different officials from the security sector, mainly the army, and army, police, and intelligence. So Mugabe just gave a very wide-ranging, rambling speech where he acknowledged the concerns that had led to the coup being conducted, but he emphasized that the country's constitutional processes would go on. It was almost as if the coup never took place. Since people were expecting that he was going to resign, this was one of the most widely watched news events in the world at the time. But then instead of resigning, Mugabe ended his address with the now infamous phrase, "Asante sana." At this point also, ZANU PF fired Mugabe as the president of the party, alongside his wife and other supporters, and other people who supported them. And this contributed to pressure that Mugabe needed to resign, because at this point, he didn't belong to any political party. So on the 21st of November, a joint parliamentary sitting of all political parties in Zimbabwe passed a motion to impeach Mugabe in order to force him to resign. And as this parliamentary sitting was going on, as you can see in the bottom left corner, a letter was delivered to the speaker, who read it while the joint parliamentary sitting was going on, indicating that Mugabe had agreed to resign. This led to euphoric celebrations in Zimbabwe and beyond, and Mnangagwa, who had fled South Africa, returned and gave a triumphant address indicating that he was now taking over as president of Zimbabwe, taking over from Mugabe. And on the 24th of November, he was sworn in as the second president that Zimbabwe has ever known. He set up a cabinet mostly consisting of ministers who had served in Mugabe's government. And this was very disappointing because people thought at this point that Mnangagwa would immediately show that he was going to institute a regime that was completely different from Mugabe's regime. His government also announced that it had granted Mugabe immunity from prosecution and that they would give him a $10 million payoff alongside a wide array of benefits such as pension, medical care, security, and budget for foreign travel. Immediately, Mnangagwa also began promoting a new mantra which he called Zimbabwe is open for business. And he started wearing a scarf bearing Zimbabwean, the flag of the colors of the Zimbabwean flag, which he wore whether it was hot or cold. Now, at this point, it's important to note that for the first time since independence, there was a strong sense of hope, excitement, and an expectation that things were going to change for the better in Zimbabwe. Although people were aware that this was not a revolution per se, still they hoped that things could get better because they had gotten really worse. So Mugabe had become an embodiment of everything that was wrong with Zimbabwe, so his removal inevitably led people to believe that things were going to get better. So local and international political commentators celebrated the fall of a dictator on one hand, while others criticized the unconstitutional change of government and called for a quick return to civilian rule. The African Union, which had initially criticized the coup, made an about turn and eventually said that it accepted the will of the people and praised Mugabe for his lifetime of service to the country of Zimbabwe. However, any expectation for real change was rather erroneous, because as I mentioned before, this was not a revolution, but it was the culmination of internal disagreements within ZANU PF's ruling elite. The coup did not necessarily result in a complete change of the ruling regime, but a replacement of its figurehead. The army was responsible for bringing Mugabe into power even before independence, and it kept him there through manipulating elections since 1980, and then removed him when his position did not represent their interests. So when Mugabe dismissed his then Vice President Mnangagwa, he upset the internal balance of power within the coalition. And so they could no longer rely on him, and this resulted in his dismissal. One of the most significant aspects of this coup is how the soldiers painstakingly tried to follow the letter of the law. For example, they had the People March. The significance of that march was that it appeared to be a mass uprising that the army just protected instead of the army being the one that removed the president from power. After Mnangagwa's inauguration on the 25th of November, the Supreme Court also issued a ruling which said that the army's activities were in line with the Constitution, and thus it was legal. So this was a very skillful way of removing Mugabe, whom few could defend, overhaul the ruling regime, and also established what was essentially a sanitized ZANU PF government. Now, the next significant episode in this whole situation was the election, which came on the 30th of July. The election was significant in several respects. It was the first time since 1980 that Mugabe did not feature as a candidate. It was also the first major test for this new regime to prove that indeed it was going to facilitate change and a shift from Mugabe-era politics of violent elections, human rights violations, and free and fair electoral contests. Investors also, foreign investors, wanted to see if the mantra that Zimbabwe was open for business was true. They also wanted to see that investments would be secure. And the statement, wait after the election, became a common answer to different inquiries in the run-up to the elections. The election would also allow Mnangagwa to institute what has been of late described as the Rwanda model of economic and political development. This is where the government established a relatively authoritarian system of government, limiting civil rights and liberties, and focusing on economic growth using a mixture of state monopolies while opening up the economy to foreign investment also. A team from the Rwanda Development Board actually visited Zimbabwe after the AU summit in Kigali in April to meet with the cabinet and different officials from Zimbabwe so that they would exchange notes on how Rwanda managed to rise from the ashes of genocide into one of the most developed countries, one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. The election would also give, and this is another important fact, that the election would give Mnangagwa an opportunity to obtain a legitimate mandate. It was a public secret that although the coup was not roundly criticized by both local and international commentators, it was still a coup, and Mnangagwa's government was illegitimate. So having an election was going to be the first step in getting some legitimacy, after which, once in power, he would now institute different measures to show a complete break from Mugabe to his own regime. And getting legitimacy would also ensure that his government would be able to access lines of credit from international institutions, get debt forgiveness, and also attract foreign investors to kickstart Zimbabwe's economy. Mnangagwa even wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times indicating that Zimbabwe had indeed reached a point of real political change. However, the election proved otherwise. The first thing was that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which was tasked with managing the election, refused to give the civil society and the opposition parties access to the voters' roll. So this voters' roll is electronic, and so giving it to the opposition and to the civil society would allow independent verification to make sure that there were no irregularities in it. But then Mnangagwa was obviously in charge of the ZEC, and the ZEC refused to avail the voters' roll for independent verification. The second thing also was that the government refused, or the ZEC refused to allow the printing of ballot papers and other electoral materials to go to open tender. Instead, they gave that contract to an unnamed company. So the handling of electoral materials was not transparent, which made it possible for the government to manipulate the election. The army also deployed soldiers in different regions, especially rural regions in Zimbabwe, well in advance of the election. They were embedded within communities, and they were deployed wearing civilian clothing. While they were embedded in communities, they made sure that they forced the local leadership to make sure that their constituents would vote for Emmerson Mnangagwa. The ZEC also refused to allow the Zimbabweans living in the diaspora an opportunity to vote, which would make an opposition win more likely. Now, once the election occurred on the 30th of July, there were minimal levels of violence. But then on the 1st of August, people marched on the streets demanding that the ZEC release its results, because in the past, with results being released more than a month after the election date, which clearly meant that the results were being manipulated. So people were marching on the 1st of August, the army opened fire, killing 6 civilians. Mnangagwa claimed that he was not aware. He claimed he was not aware who had deployed the soldiers, even though he's the commander-in-chief. The commander of the Zimbabwean army, General Valerio Sibanda, also claimed he did not know who deployed the soldiers either. The army eventually issued a statement saying that they did not know who those people were, even though they were wearing Zimbabwe army camouflage and they were using Zimbabwe army vehicles. Now, this episode was very important because it showed that there were 2 centers of power after Mugabe left. Mnangagwa on one hand as the president, but also General Chiwenga on the other hand as the de facto leader of the security services. So there might actually be some truth to the fact that Mnangagwa did not know who deployed the army, but Chiwenga did. And the fact that the commander of the Zimbabwe National Army did not know who deployed the soldiers was another telling example that the chain of command in the army was broken. So now we'll move on to the results of the election. The ZEC released the results on the 3rd of August, indicating that Mnangagwa had won the election by 50.8%. This figure was very significant in that it slightly gave Mnangagwa an opportunity to avoid a runoff, because our constitution says that if both candidates or if the two leading candidates get below 50%, then there would be a runoff. So he got just enough to avoid a runoff. His closest challenger, opposition leader Nelson Chamisa, earned 44.3%. Now, immediately the opposition filed a petition with the Supreme Court highlighting the several irregularities that I mentioned earlier. The Constitutional Court dismissed their application, paving way for Mnangagwa to be sworn in as president. However, the EU Observer Mission issued a statement on 7 August indicating that although Mnangagwa had won and although there were relatively lower levels of violence in this election, Mnangagwa had benefited from unfair electoral practices. Mnangagwa was subsequently sworn in on the 26th of August, and he set out to appoint a cabinet. Now, this cabinet was also important because it was another opportunity for Mnangagwa to show that indeed there was a shift from the previous administration. Now, key highlights of this cabinet are as follows. He dropped several ministers who had served under Mugabe, some of whom were in power or in office for more than 20 years. This included the former finance minister, Patrick Chinamasa, the former home affairs minister, Obet Mpofu, the former health minister, David Parenyatwa, who were all very unpopular and regarded as incompetent. Mnangagwa went on to appoint well-known technocrats as ministers. For instance, he appointed the former chief economist and vice president of the African Development Bank, Mutuli Ngube, as the finance minister. He appointed a mining executive, Winston Chitando, as a mining minister, and also academic professor Amon Murira as the higher education minister. He appointed a young popular swimmer called Kirsty Coventry as the minister for sports. So in this case, he was trying to signal to both local and foreign partners that he was committed to establishing a cabinet that focused more on competence than rewarding political supporters. Mnangagwa also appointed the first female minister for defense, Opamu Chinguri, which again was an attempt to signal that he was committed to gender diversity and that by removing Chiwenga from direct control of the army, fears that Chiwenga was not accountable to anyone would be allayed. However, the army also had a relatively high number of soldiers. Although they were small numerically in terms of numbers, it was significant that former soldiers were serving in high-profile positions in the government. This was Chiwenga, who was vice president, Sibusiso Moyo, the gentleman who announced the coup on TV as the foreign minister, and Perence Shiri, the former Air Force commander, who was appointed as the agriculture and land affairs minister. Now, moving forward, the current state of affairs have given a first indicator of the way things are right now and what the future looks like. So there are currency shortages currently in Zimbabwe. In 2009, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe resolved to institute what they called a multi-currency regime. So prices are valued in US dollars in Zimbabwe, and the US dollar is legal tender. However, our Reserve Bank does not mint US dollars. So that means the money has to come from outside. So what's been happening is that there's a shortage of US dollars. Companies are failing to import their different inputs and spare parts for machinery. And this is a contribution to high inflation, which currently stands at 155%. Currency shortages have also resulted in shortages of fuel and basic commodities. So things like bread, sugar, cooking oil, and other foodstuffs are in short supply. So this has resulted in companies shutting down because they can actually not do business. Some are shutting down because they cannot price their goods properly. Some are also using what they call a multiple tier pricing, where they will give you a different price to the same commodity depending on how you are paying for it. So if, for example, you go to a supermarket and you want to pay electronically, there's a different price. If you have US dollars, there's a relatively lower price, and so forth. There's also a brewing scandal over revelations that this economic crisis is a result of the activities of a certain cartel that is operating behind the government. For example, it has been alleged that well-connected individuals have been getting foreign currency allocations from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe to buy fuel. But instead of going out to import fuel from places like Mozambique or South Africa, they sell that foreign currency on the black market, and then the fuel is never delivered. These claims have resulted in several senior high-ranking officials from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe being suspended. Now, when it comes to discussing prospects for the future, these are the realities, and I use these 4 main points to outline what's happening in the country right now and how it will shape what happens in the future. So the first thing is militarized politics. Now, although the army conducted this coup, it has always been working in the background since independence. It has always been the mainstay of Mugabe's power. It has always been effectively in charge. As it stands, Chiwenga controls the army and the rest of the security sector and is widely regarded as the power behind the throne. It uses violence and other forms of manipulation to ensure that the candidate that they are in alliance with wins the election. Inevitably, in a situation like this, democracy does not flourish. Secondly, there's a military business party-state nexus. Army commanders, ZANU PF officials, and other business people whose names I know that, but would probably not name at the moment, they work in cahoots with individuals who are in power to maintain their economic interests. They have interests in mining, foreign currency trading, fuel imports, and even weapons supply. Both Chiwenga and Mnangagwa are reportedly part of this cartel. And in fact, there have been several reports to this effect. For example, the United Nations issued a report in 2002. It was entitled "A Report on the Exploitation of Natural Resources in the Democratic Republic of Congo." It showed how different elite networks in Uganda, Rwanda, and Zimbabwe were engaged in illicit trade of minerals for weapons. And Global Witness also issued a report in 2017 entitled "An Inside Job, the State, the Security Forces, and a Decade of Disappearing Diamonds," which showed how the army, the intelligence, and other business people in Zimbabwe and outside collaborated to siphon Zimbabwe's diamonds and revenue out of the country. Mugabe himself even complained in 2016 at his birthday that Zimbabwe had lost up to 15 billion United States dollars in this way. Given that the country is being run by a cartel, it means that the prospects for future political and economic development are quite dim. There's also a generational divide in Zimbabwean society and politics. Because of the way things are, young people, especially from ordinary families, find it difficult to grow and flourish. Educational institutions are underfunded, and the standard of education in the country has been deteriorating at all levels of the education system. The weak economy is also unable to supply jobs, and currently there is about 80% rate of unemployment. So politics and the economy are not able to support young people and allow them to develop their potential. Thousands of young graduates have been forced to migrate to neighboring countries and beyond in search of a better life. So this brain drain kills innovation. It even kills a spirit of patriotism, whereby young people are committed or they choose to work towards developing their own country and addressing the different problems that affect their society. And lastly, the liberation ideology and politics of the cult of personality. Now, this has been almost a defining feature of Zimbabwe's politics since independence. Zimbabwe used to be a British colony, and several nationalists, including Robert Mugabe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, General Chiwenga, and others, were at the forefront of these nationalist activities. Now, a civil war resulted in Zimbabwe getting political independence in 1980, and Chiwenga and Mnangagwa were actually soldiers in that war. Mugabe wasn't a soldier, but he was the civilian leader who could go out and negotiate with the different parties, which eventually led to independence. Now, people who've served in government have mostly been drawn from this pool of nationalist leaders. Any political leader who did not serve in that liberation war is automatically disqualified and delegitimized. So that means, as it stands, the generation of young people who were born after this liberation war are disqualified from serving in politics unless their interests align with those who are in power. So this liberation ideology ties with the cult of personality. And this is the reason why I framed the title of this talk the way I did, which some even said to me was quite unusual. The rooster falls and the crocodile rises. So there's this culture of assigning certain markers to politicians based on their perceived or actual personal characteristics. So Mnangagwa, for example, is known as a very cruel person, very sly, very conniving. In fact, he was Mugabe's enforcer. Before Mugabe even became president, Mnangagwa served as his personal assistant. So Mugabe and Mnangagwa worked together for about 50 years. Mnangagwa was always at the center of whatever Mugabe was doing. And this even involved targeted killings or the genocide that occurred in Zimbabwe between 1982 to 1987. So he has this reputation for being a demagogic individual, very, indefatigable. And so he's regarded as untouchable. And the fact that after he was fired, Zimbabwe did its first coup fed into that narrative that he indeed is a crocodile who beat down the rooster. Now, Mugabe was called a rooster for a reason. The rooster is the head of the coup. So when Mugabe came into the presidency, he was prime minister in 1980 before he became president, Jongwe, or the rooster, was the sign of his authority. It was an embodiment of his authority. So when you think of a rooster in a coup, it's unchallenged, it's the father of the house, so to speak. And all these things are bad for democratic politics. Because in democratic politics, political leaders do not necessarily have a messianic duty. They are not entitled to office, no matter what they've done in the past for the country, no matter what personal sacrifices they've made. Democratic politics requires that leaders are voted into office on merit, they stay there on merit, and if they fail, they are voted out. Their personalities and narratives of how they became to be who they are not really essential. So the politics of cult of personality has resulted in these political leaders being mythical gods who are, in fact, self-seeking and greedy political leaders. Now, to conclude, these facts inevitably inform a pessimistic conclusion, a pessimistic idea of what the future holds for Zimbabwe. The coup was not a revolution, as I mentioned, in the spirit of the Arab Spring, but it was a reorganization of power in an elite that is still in power today. It was more of a process of renewal. And I remember listening to a speaker who said what happened in Zimbabwe was similar to a snake shedding off its skin. So it's renewing itself. So that it's better, its skin is nicer, and it's energized to do more. Now, although Mnangagwa has displayed some inclination to establish a political and economic system that facilitates economic growth, relative openness, and transparency, all his policies will have to be in line with what the ruling cartel wants, its interests and its objectives. This weakens government institutions which are supposed to implement policy. This weakens the rule of law. This weakens the establishment of a free market. So at the end of the day, what we have here is a nation in captivity. There is a lot of literature on the captured state. And I feel that the idea of a captured state would imply that the state was not captured before. But in the case of Zimbabwe, the state was captured even before it became a state. What I mean is that because of the militarized nature of our transition from colonialism to independence, people who are in power now are essentially soldiers. So when they came into the state fell within the limits of their interests. So it was difficult for an independent state to be established because the people who are in charge made sure that whatever government policies are implemented, they have to fit what their personal interests dictate. However, it's possible that Zimbabwe will experience some level of political and economic growth, and this is because of the following reasons. This Rwandese model that Mnangagwa admires fits well with this ruling coalition's way of operating. Now, what's been happening is that the key economic sectors in the country are controlled by members of this coalition. Mining, agriculture, export, import, manufacturing. There are individuals who have been identified who control these things. Now, this so-called Rwandese model is actually not new. It's actually known in development literature, in political economy literature, as the developmental state. This is widely credited with influencing economic growth in different countries such as China, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia. And essentially, the government coalition, or the governing coalition, monopolizes economic sectors, it monopolizes economic opportunities, and conducts economics on its own terms. It conducts politics on its own terms. And the byproduct of this monopolistic behavior is some form of economic growth. So economic growth is mostly measured using GDP. And when GDP increases, it's very easy to justify that the policies that the government is instituting are working. And that's exactly what's been happening in Rwanda. Now, although this indeed will result in some form of economic development and job creation, the idea that civil and political liberties need to be sacrificed for economic growth is very immoral. And that's exactly what's been happening in Rwanda. Different people who are outside of Kigali, who are so-called invisible people, who are in poverty, are not part of the narrative that is being spread all over the world right now as far as Rwanda is concerned. Different individuals who have been assassinated by the ruling coalition in Rwanda have not been spoken of. I remember in South Africa one time, where I lived before coming to North America, a former senior government official in Rwanda was assassinated, reportedly on the orders of the ruling coalition in Rwanda. So all of this information is publicly available. And now, if we're going to transfer this model to Zimbabwe, that means we might just end up having the same circumstances as far as human rights violations and a non-transparent government is concerned. There's also another possibility that the government will try to give some form of, to promote some form of openness, to promote civil liberties here and there. For example, during Mugabe's time, you could say something against him while you were on your way. Let's say you're using public transportation, you're on the way to a certain destination. By the time you get off, a police officer would arrest you, or an intelligence officer would arrest you. But these days, people have been speaking out against Mnangagwa and they don't get arrested, although a certain level of repression still exists. So on the whole, although I've indicated some of these reasons why the outlook is pessimistic, there might be some form of change which comparatively is better than what has been experienced during Mugabe's time. But on the whole, whatever will happen will only happen on the ruling coalition's terms. So I conclude with the caveat that politics tends to be unpredictable. We never imagined that today we'd be calling Robert Mugabe as the former president of Zimbabwe. So we continue hoping against hope that one day real change will come to Zimbabwe. Thank you. So now we open the floor for questions. Yes. Oh, you can go ahead.
So, thank you so much for this great talk. I learned a lot and enjoyed your talk a lot. It seems to me that the transition was more from a conventional style of dictatorship to a new mode of authoritarianism. But still, as you hope, there might be some window of opportunity for change. But I'd like to ask two main things. What about social movements? Like, is there any grassroots thing coming from bottom that might create some pressure? And the other question is more like the association that you brought with openness and transparency in the economy. And this might be as well the case that the regime is very authoritarian. Just think about in other places in New Brazil, Hungary, Turkey. You know, the economy could be well open and open to foreign investment, but it doesn't necessarily need to be transparent. So the same structure can just go on forever, including attracting more foreign direct investment and others. So how do you think this might be effective in the future?
So if I understood your last question, well, yeah, you're saying that the authoritarian systems might keep on attracting investment and they keep going. All right, so I'll start from the first one. In terms of social movements, generally it's very precarious to run a social movement in Zimbabwe, especially one that does not align with the government's interests. The government has traditionally used the police and the army to crush down any dissent. And I remember reading yesterday that there are different organizations that have tried to mobilize marches against the ongoing economic problems, and the army or the government indicated that they will not tolerate that. But there's one social movement that stands out that was started by a pastor called Ivan Mawarire, called This Flag. This is where it just started with him posting a video on his phone wearing a Zimbabwean flag, complaining about the way things were in the country, and it went viral because of effective use of social media. It attracted so much interest and support within Zimbabwe and from outside of Zimbabwe, and that imposed a lot of pressure on the Mugabe regime during its terminal stages. Now, Ivan Mawarire has been arrested several times, thrown into prison, and his case only got dismissed when Mugabe was kicked out of office. So this is an example of a social movement. So it's not entirely impossible to establish a strong grassroots movement against the government, but it comes at a very high level of risk, personal risk particularly, and the threats to life even. Now when it comes to the longevity of authoritarianism and its ability to attract foreign support, that is exactly what the Mnangagwa government is hoping for, that eventually investors, multilateral partners, international organizations would turn a blind eye to some of the human rights violations and just make a trade-off, right? Say, okay, let's just let the economy grow and then eventually we can see some changes in the political system. So yes, there's a possibility that this regime is going to survive for a long time. In fact, there are a lot of cases where former nationalist movements have become dominant parties that stay in power for a very long time. Botswana is an example. Botswana is a shining example of democracy, but one party has been in power since 1965. South Africa is the same. ANC has been in power since 1994. Namibia, SWAPO, same thing. So there's actually growing literature around this idea that liberation movements have problems democratizing. And this becomes worse if the liberation movement used to be a military organization in the case of ZANU PF, for example. So yeah, there's a great chance that this regime will keep shedding its skin for the foreseeable future. Yes?
So on that, you were mentioning that starting with Mugabe and now with Mnangagwa. I'm totally.
That name is very difficult to pronounce.
I can't do it, that's for sure. Both of them have been soldiers and in some, or at least functioned in some important capacity in the previous civil war. Do you see any possible avenue for improvement in the government while people from that era are still alive and functioning in the government, or do you think that they just have to age out for any progress to be made?
I think for the most part they're going to have to age out. That's the unfortunate reality, that anything aside from that would be a welcome surprise. And it's unfortunate because it's really immoral to wait for someone to die so that things will change. But that's the stark reality that Zimbabwe has, especially given that, you know, if you're not a former liberation war veteran, you're not supposed to be a legitimate political leader. That, you know, that makes it difficult for young people to even consider going into politics. Now, this doesn't mean that young people don't get involved in politics at all. In the last election, because of this feeling of, you know, a new era, this euphoria that things had changed, several young professionals came together and formed a loose movement of independent candidates, candidates for members of parliament. They mostly lost. They decided not to associate themselves with one political party or another because they felt political parties, you know, were not well run. So ZANU PF was a non-starter on one hand. The MDC, which is the largest opposition political party, was, you know, a non-starter on the other hand because they were also having problems. The former president of the opposition, called Shingirai, died of cancer in February, and the guy who succeeded him, who eventually ran against Mnangagwa, is a young pastor, lawyer. He's 40 years old, and during the election, some chiefs actually said, he's wasting his time. We will not have a toddler run the country. See, so, and then he lost. But all these other young people also lost, partly because they were not, you know, they were doing this for the first time. They're not part of a powerful political machine that would fund them and manipulate results on their behalf. So, you know, there's a period of waiting, a considerably long period of waiting that we're going to have to see through until the new generation comes in. But it's also possible that from within this regime, we might find some reformist ideologies growing, because I think there's a realization that, you know, economic and political stability does not necessarily threaten political longevity, right? So, for example, the ANC is running a relatively strong economy, a relatively open political system, and they keep winning elections. They've had problems, especially in the last regime of former President Jacob Zuma, who was in and out of courts. He's still in and out of courts because of corruption cases. But the ANC has still managed to win because of several reasons. Because it's a former nationalist party, but it's also because of the magic of some of its leaders like Nelson Mandela. So gradually it's being seen that even Botswana also, Botswana is a democracy, everyone loves Botswana, but the one party has been in power for such a long time. So I believe that there's a possibility that Mnangagwa and his friends will realize that perhaps they can still survive while the rest of the country survives also. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have two questions. The first one is, how much would you say that Grace Mugabe's involvement within the politics of the government ushered in the coup that we saw in November? The second one would be, to what extent would you say that this new cabinet and this new government that we're seeing, which is more open to having people who were previously marginalized, such as the Ndebele people, white people in Zimbabwe, women in parliament, is more of tokenization than really effective change?
Great. So the first question, Grace Mugabe and the role that she played in the coup. She played a central role in the sense that in the run-up to the coup, actually starting from 2014, she suddenly became the most powerful person in Zimbabwe. Mainly because she stepped into the factional politics that was going on in ZANU PF at the time. So what happened was that Grace Mugabe became, so she was first appointed as the president of the Women's League, right, the ZANU PF Women's League, which gave her a political platform to speak, and she went around the country conducting rallies. So what happened was that she became the mouthpiece of this faction called the G40, Generation 40 faction. So essentially the split in this ruling party which led to the coup was mainly between the older generation and the younger generation, right? So the younger generation was called Generation 40, the older ones who were led by Mnangagwa were called Lacoste from the fashion brand, which is Crocodile. So Grace Mugabe became the mouthpiece of the Generation 40 faction. And, oh, sorry, I thought someone was speaking to me. So what happened was that Mugabe's political opponents started falling one by one the moment Grace Mugabe targeted them, right? So she became the weapon that the Generation 40 could use. So people in the Mnangagwa camp started falling out of government very quickly. And so this coup was a last-ditch effort to make sure that they all don't end up in jail. Because what holds this coalition together is the balance of power and understanding of mutual interest around staying in power and controlling all the economic opportunities that the country offers. But when there was a divide between the winners and the losers, with Grace Mugabe being at the forefront of the supposed winners, then the other guys had to take drastic measures to get Mugabe out of power. And there's actually information coming up now that this coup did not just happen in November last year, but it was in the works for quite a while. It was just a matter of time if Mugabe stayed in power. Now, when it comes to diversity and tokenism, I would say to consider there's a mix. So when it comes to elections, right, elections sometimes reflect underlying social dynamics, right? So for example, in Harare, because it's the capital and because it's mostly dominated by the Shona, you have more Shona candidates, and so you have more Shona members of parliament. And that's the case with the rest of the country, right? There, Shona is a big group, but then there's different subgroups within it. And so those social dynamics influence who gets into parliament. When it comes to appointments, that's when you see some of the tokenism coming up. So one of the reasons why it's difficult sometimes to simply call it tokenism is that if elections result in imbalance in parliament or in government, and then those in power try to make up for that imbalance by appointing others, you could say that's just a way of trying to balance out the equation, but you could also call it tokenism. So I guess we just have to look at each situation and judge it by its merits, but it could be either or. That's a very safe answer to give, right? Yes?
Would you say that African leaders are afraid of female power or women power, girl power, whatever it is? Because, like, considering what happened in South Africa when Jacob Zuma's wife was climbing the political ladder, and what happened in Zimbabwe when Grace Mugabe was climbing the political ladder as well. Because I feel like it was mainly Grace Mugabe who actually pushed those men to do what they did. So is it that as Africans we're really afraid of women taking power, like actually doing it themselves, unlike Ethiopia where they appointed the woman? Is it the fear or what do you think?
I wouldn't say African leaders are afraid of women. Also, African male leaders are afraid of women leaders. So that's actually a very, very interesting question, which is very complicated to answer, but I'll try. So I'll start off from the other side. Uganda and Rwanda, for example, just to mention a few, have been commended for having a very high number of women in government. In fact, there's something interesting in Uganda called women member of parliament, right? There are seats that are ring-fenced for women to contest, right? So whether that region does not, likes having female leaders or not, they have to vote for a woman. Kagame is the same thing. I think about half of his cabinet is women. You've got women in very powerful positions, like the chief executive officer of the Rwanda Development Board, which basically runs the country. is a woman. So I think I acknowledge where you're coming from, that some socio-cultural attitudes are not comfortable with having female leaders, which again goes into the argument that I made earlier, that sometimes the candidates that you get from the primaries to the actual election reflect underlying social attitudes. So to an extent, that is very, very correct. But in some way, you can see that there's a gradual shift whereby incumbents, political incumbents, are appointing more women into office, even though they don't. I mean, they don't have to win an election; they just get appointed. So I think it's a more sort of double-pronged strategy of maybe having more women run for office, but also women appointed into strategic positions. Because the process of changing attitudes, I see you are itching to answer a follow-up question. The process of changing attitudes can be gradual, but then it needs some of these strategies at different levels to make it happen. You gave the example of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and Grace Mugabe. Now, those leaders came into the spotlight in unique political circumstances. So Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is a very a veteran politician. She rose up the ranks. She became the chair of the AU for a few years. But when she came into the context of South Africa's election, where Jacob Zuma was trying to maintain his political influence, it seemed as if her attempt to become the president of the ANC was Zuma trying to extend his influence. So if she came into the picture in a different context, we probably would have had a different outcome. Grace Mugabe is the same situation. She, you saw the rallies. All the rallies that she staged were essentially attacks for attacking different people. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about socio-economic development. It was just attacking people who were on the other side of the aisle. So, yeah.
The two examples that you gave earlier, I said
Uganda and Rwanda.
Do you feel like that it's a way of this men in power to stay in power by trying to be attractive to people and say, oh, okay, there's gender equality, what are you complaining about? Do you think it's part of that? Because I've had Rwandans talking about how these women don't really have a voice in parliament. So do you think it's that? Or there's ordinary Rwandans are just talking nonsense?
No, there's a considerable degree of truth to that. In fact, I was in Uganda the last few months, and I remember reading an article about femocracy, right? Someone was complaining that women are being used to make these dictators look good. So there's a degree of truth to that, because it's politics. That's the nature of the beast. But at the same time, there are always unintended consequences when it comes to social affairs, social-political affairs. So the politician might be trying to make himself look good, but then he changes social attitudes while he's at it. So, yeah.
Yes. So I was curious, you mentioned the courts decided that the coup was constitutional. What are the rules governing, the constitutional rules governing government transition in Zimbabwe? And is there any plausibility to the court's ruling, or was it a sort of...
Yeah, that ruling was actually very controversial, because generally a coup is not provided for in the Constitution, because there are different mechanisms through which a new president is appointed, whether the incumbent dies or is becoming incapacitated or things like that. But I believe that the clause that the courts and other people who justified the courts, the coup were using, I forget the actual clause in the name of the clause, but I've read it, and it's basically, it's quite vague also. It says that the army is empowered to intervene for national interest, right? National interest can be anything. So the interpretation is really broad, and it can be easily abused. So yeah, that ruling was very controversial, because it took a certain interpretation of the law to justify a coup, which cannot be justified in terms of constitutional principle governing political transitions. Yeah. Yes.
So as you said before, Morgan Shingirai is like the face of the opposition. So what do you think the impact of his death was on the NDC? Like, did it create splinters? Or like what is the state of the NDC now without Shingirai?
Changre's death was actually unfortunate for the MDC. I know his ill health and death, because when he was ill, he was also not as active as he used to be. And his death came just before a very important election. But I can say initially it weakened the party, especially when Nelson Chamisa was fighting with the other, more senior leaders in the party, and he was called a dictator and things like that. So at that point, the party was weakened. But I think in the run-up to the election, Chamisa actually managed to re-energize the party. He had the most well-attended rallies in the country. And judging by the figures that the ZEC showed, Chamisa actually stood a good chance of winning. I don't want to make any illegal statement by saying he actually won, but that's open to interpretation. Although, he stood an excellent chance of winning against Mnangagwa. So yes, initially it weakened the party, but then he's managed to survive, and the party has managed to survive. Now, they're actually going towards an election right now to appoint a substantive leader and a new executive. And we'll see whether, the support that was shown during the election translate to support within the party. Yes?
What do you think was the significance of the Constitutional Court hearing and everything, which concluded by dismissing Mnangagwa's Chamisa's
Application.
Yeah.
Petition.
Yeah, because when I was at home, people were saying that it was a good thing because the international community can see how Mnangagwa is going with the whole political climate. So, what do you think as a politician, political scientist, what do you think? What's your take on that?
So what's the significance of the ruling?
Yeah, the Constitutional Court and the ruling.
I would say the ruling was not surprising. In fact, the outcome of the election, the outcome of this whole episode was not surprising, because Mnangagwa came into power through a coup. ZANU PF was divided. Remember, he was almost killed. Just before the election, there was a grenade attack, and he was almost killed, and up to today, that has never been resolved. So it was difficult to imagine a scenario where Mnangagwa lost the election. So the court ruling was inevitable, in fact. It was just a matter of them finding something intelligent to say about, to justify their decision. So although, there were high-powered lawyers from South Africa representing the MDC, and the availability of sufficient evidence showing that, there were irregularities with this election, it was difficult to imagine Mnangagwa actually losing. Because losing would have meant a lot of things for him and everyone else supported him. Suddenly the coup was going to become illegal, they're going to be charged with treason, they're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Yes. I guess it's a follow-up?
No, I wasn't here at the beginning of the talk, but I was wondering, because you're saying that it wasn't a thing, right? It wouldn't have make sense in a way for Mnangagwa to use. And I'm thinking that because they also have military power, what do you think would have been? Because the military is supposed to stay permanent, but it's not in Zimbabwe terms. What do you think would have looked like if actually there was no meeting or anything and opposition won? What do you think?
So you want me to just use my imagination to figure out what would have happened if Mnangagwa lost the election?
Yeah.
That's a tall order. Well, if Mnangagwa lost and Chamisa came into office, the army would have pledged its allegiance to Chamisa as the new commander-in-chief. The MDC and ZANU PF would engage in talks to establish whether Chamisa would arrest everyone who was involved in the coup and everyone who has committed crimes in the last 20 years. That ZANU PF has been committing crimes against the Zimbabwean people. For the sake of stability, they'll probably not arrest them immediately, but maybe later. So, I could keep going. But I see a situation where there would be some kind of an arrangement that would facilitate a smooth transition, and then retribution starts coming later on. Yes?
So you put a lot of emphasis on how the new regime is putting a lot of emphasis on foreign investment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that this emphasis on foreign investment might open Zimbabwe to outside political interference in the future?
To a certain extent, yes. And it's a key feature of African political economy that some of these governments are so hungry for foreign aid and foreign investment that they just negotiate very horrible contracts. And that's an ongoing conversation right now regarding Chinese investments on the continent, which do not come with conditionalities. So I do feel that to a certain extent, some of these contracts will keep, or would Zimbabwe has had these outcomes in any case with foreign interference. So when Mugabe became unpopular and he became isolated, starting in 2000, 2003, when the US Congress passed the sanctions law, Mugabe instituted what he called a look east policy. So concentrating on China and its allies and ignoring the United States, UK, and other European countries. And so the reason why these countries end up having terrible contracts is because they don't have any leverage. And also it's because they desperately need money to run their governments, to support their budgets, money to steal, put it plainly, money to steal. And there's been bad contracts in mining, mostly, in infrastructure. So for example, we have situations whereby bridges or roads are built, but then the government doesn't own them. The public doesn't actually, the public as citizenry don't own that infrastructure because it's mortgaged. The same conversation is going on right now in Uganda, whereby the government has been borrowing at a very alarming pace, reportedly borrowing against future oil revenues, and they haven't even started pumping oil, so there are fears that once Uganda starts pumping oil, the revenues are mortgaged, to the Chinese loans, and so forth and so on. So yes, it's actually worrying when you hear leaders, political leaders of sovereign countries, pandering to foreign investors. But also there are different levels. So as political leaders, they represent the people who put them into office, right? They have a delegated authority. Investment is a different type of beast, right? Investors have a much narrower purview. They are looking at profit, right? And it's perfectly legitimate, right? That's business. Business is driven by profit, capital, profit, and more profit, right? But then when profit motives and political motives collide in that situation, political and socio-economic objectives might be subordinated. So yes, there's a danger. So there's need for these governments to really pay attention to contracts. Investment is not bad, but the contracts and the context in which this money comes in is very, very important. Yeah. Yes.
So Zimbabwe experimented, I think, on 2 occasions with prime ministerial kind of governments when there was, in the early days of independence. And somewhere around 2000, the latter part of 2009 to early 2010, thereabouts. In both cases, the systems went away very shortly, and Mugabe emerged as the president in a new kind of governance system, presidential system. I don't know if you can speak to the nature of, how in terms of human rights, for instance, how those periods, how human rights played in those 2 periods of when there was a prime ministerial system, and that is to say, effectively there somehow was a check, on the powers of the president and maybe other institutions of government. That compared to these times that we have had only the president, the person of Mugabe, and now
Mnangagwa. Yeah. So that's a very interesting question because it talks, it speaks to the debate between politics and institutions, right? So when Mugabe was prime minister from 1980 to 1987, he was an executive prime minister, so essentially he was president. The president at the time was a ceremonial president. And then from 2009 to 2013, when Mnangagwa was prime minister, Mugabe was an executive president, and Mnangagwa was the head of government. So when Mugabe was prime minister initially, he had unchecked power. Remember, this is the time when Zimbabwe had a genocide. And he deployed an elite army unit to kill about 20,000 civilians in the southern region of the country. So again, that's an example of unchecked power. Parliament was unable to check that. And it went on for years, right? 1982, 5 years. It went on for 5 years. And at the end of this episode, Mugabe established himself as an executive president, and he abolished the prime ministerial position. So he actually became more powerful after that. During the 2009-2013 episode, Mnangagwa was frustrated at every turn because he was in this political system as an opposition politician, surrounded by ruling party establishment politicians. So he could not independently implement different policies, and he could not check Mugabe's excesses. And the whole arrangement actually was frustrating for everyone. ZANU PF was frustrated because Mnangagwa was making them look bad. Mnangagwa was frustrated because his hands were tied. So that's why in 2013 they had to go for an election, and ZANU PF said that they were not keen to get into a government of national unity again. So the crux of the matter is that no matter what institutional structures you have, politics of the day will always determine who gets what, when, and how. So yeah, institutions are subordinate to politics in most cases. Yeah. Any questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much.